So I don't know if I've ever seen the kind of show of power that we saw a week ago, Saturday, in Buffalo, New York. And I'm not talking about the young man who was heavily armed, because that's not power. That's desperation and fear and lostness and brokenness. I'm talking about those 10 people who were lost. Like the very oldest one, Ruth Whitfield, 86 years old. She was coming from the nursing home where she'd been visiting her husband of 68 years. And for the last 8 years, daily, she had gone to see him to wash his face and shave him and cut his hair and iron his clothes and care for him. And she didn't just love her husband unconditionally, her 4 children. Her daughter said, she wasn't just my mom, she was my best friend. We did everything together. We went fishing and camping, and she said, black people don't camp, but we went camping. And her son said, she was a mother to the motherless. Just this incredible person. And then there was Pearlie Young, one of the other matriarchs that was killed. She was 77. It wasn't just her son and her grandchildren who adored her. Her son was coming back to Tops to pick him up. Normally, they would run errands during the week, too, and she would always say, don't come until Young and the Restless is over, because that was her favorite soap opera. But she wasn't just adored by her children and grandchildren. She was, at 77, still substituting in the high school because she believed it was her faith to give back. And she, for decades, as a pastor's wife, was the head of the Sunday school for 70 churches, teaching and, kind of crafting this incredible stuff for children to learn. And for 25 years, you could find her on Saturdays serving food to the hungry people in Buffalo. Her son said, my mom, she was an incredible person. And it wasn't just the oldest, the youngest to die. Roberta Drury was 32. Talk about the life of the party. One of the stories about her, it wasn't a story in the newspaper, it was just 14 photographs of her smiling from the time she was little bitty in a pumpkin outfit, and then at little family weddings, and then at parties, and the headline was, Roberta Drury couldn't show up without a smile. And another story talked about how she loved Whitney Houston, and was a collector of friends and a force of love. She was adopted when she was 18 months old after foster care into this all-white family. And her sister Amanda, her new sister, they shared bunk beds together. And she said she never stopped. She was always dancing and singing. She was the absolute life of the party. She said when she was a little girl, she would go and go and go and go and go until she fell fast asleep in the middle of her joy and just collapsed. And it never stopped. Even now when she'd call her sister, every time her sister would answer the phone, she'd start breaking into Whitney Houston, I want to dance with somebody. That's just who she was, right? And it wasn't that she didn't have her own struggles. She was a young adult, right? Depression sometimes kept her from working, and some addiction. But she was coming out of that, and a decade ago she moved back to Buffalo to help her brother who was going through cancer and bone marrow transplants, to help with the kids, and she had just stayed there. That was the kind of person that she was. People said to be in Roberta's orbit was to be loved fiercely and limitlessly. Once you were in her heart, you were in her heart forever. That's power. That is power. The kind of power that when you walk into a room, like the whole place lifts, and people are just drawn to you. Not always just the big, loud person, sometimes the quiet person, right? The kind of quiet person who also knows the right thing to say or when nothing needs to be said. That's the kind of power that we hear today in this passage from Acts, the 16th chapter, about Lydia. Now, sometimes we can get confused about what power is, right? Like we think power is the tank rolling into Ukraine, or we think it's the kid with all the armor, or we think it's power status. And even the church can be confused. I think about how I learned this lesson, when I was in seminary, that here was this remarkable woman in this patriarchal system, and she had power and money, and she was a businesswoman, and so when she was baptized, the whole household was baptized, and her house became the center of the movement. But then recently, as more feminist scholars have kind of weighed in, people have said, are we sure she was really making that much money? And are we sure that dyeing purple cloth was really a powerful thing? Because there's two ways, as it turns out, to make purple. One, take snails, you know, and it's an expensive way, but then there's the vegetarian vegan way, which is less harsh on the earth and a lot cheaper. And people are like, could be that that's really what she was doing. And then there's these ancient authors like Cicero and Plutarch who talk about how dye work was really sort of like being a fast food worker, sanitation worker. These were the people on the margins, pushed out, which is where, you know, Lydia and her family were, out down by the river. So people have been like, yeah, maybe Luke by this point wants Lydia to look a little more acceptable. Anyway, people write dissertations about Lydia and whether she was high class or low class, working class or whatever. The point is, why was Lydia powerful? Lydia was powerful, and we know it because what? People were around her. People were drawn to her because when she experienced a sense of God and passion and joy in her life, other people felt it. It kind of came out of her and it drew them in, right? So I was asking my friend Wallace again about what he was preaching on. And he said that about, you know, we're losing 10 houses a day, Holly. 10 people over there losing their houses, like losing a life. And so what I'm preaching on is looking for that power, looking for that goodness all around. And it's not just in little individuals, right? Because that's what we know. We know that there's also this power of when people come together. Community, right? Community that's created. I think about the stories about Tops Friendly Market. Some of you may have seen the beautiful stories about the east side of Buffalo, the black side, Jefferson Avenue. And it was a place, it is a place where people are family. I mean, you read about it. I mean, it's a community. People stay there. They know one another. The old people hang out on the porch and they hang out under the tree and they speak to all the kids when they go by. And Tops Friendly Market had become an anchor there in the last 20 years and been 25 years or so when they didn't even have a grocery store. But before that, that community was an anchor. It was a place of power. It was a place where people felt encouraged. And when you read about the shopping store, you could just tell that people were loud and talking and hanging out. And I couldn't help but think about how different that is from the Whole Foods near me. That place is gleaming and shiny and quiet. I mean, it's quiet. Like, I don't know if anybody, I don't go to the grocery store, thankfully, but nobody ever taught, you know, it's just this really little, and I thought about community. And we all know this, and we can go on about small town America and all the scholars and sociologists who've been saying this for 50 or 60 years, that the fabric that we had at one point, the mom and pop store, the way people knew each other, how it's been frayed. But we also know there are people trying to create community. And we have to keep looking for that and looking for the power, because when we see it somewhere, then it says to us, that's what I want too. One of my favorite communities is Operation Breakthrough at 31st and Troost, where I go on Monday afternoon for an hour or two and hang out with these little kids, because I'm trying to be supportive of all of our teachers who are doing this, you know, year after year after year. And I love it because the little kids are fascinated with me, because a lot of them have never seen an old white person. And so when I'm sitting there next to them, they're like fascinated with my arms, which I had not really looked at my arms and thought how incredibly ugly they are, until the kids are like, why is your arm so ugly? And it's like, because I have been a runner for 40 years, my arms, I have like massively huge veins and like sunspot, and they're like, oh my God, that is so ugly. But the kids, they're real fascinated with it. It kind of is like it like keeps them focused, trace them while they're working on their letters, and like, you know. But the real thing that's amazing about that community is so loud in there. I mean, you go in there to pick up the kids, or parents are coming and going. I mean, people are hanging out, right? I mean, this is not like people pulling up with their nice little car and you run out there and no. People are in there to know one another and to be known. There are people who went to school there and people whose parents went to school there. People are there to be changed and transformed, right? And that's what I like about Peace Church. That's why I think we're also on the right track, because you know what? It's getting noisier in here. A lot noisier. Now after church, you figure you can't make it to the ball game for an hour because people are standing around and talking. We put their lights off and people just stay around. And we're finding ways to, even for people who aren't here, to keep connecting, right? Like we said, hey, we need shepherds. We need a way to be more connected. Like in a few days, I recruited 40 people That's a lot. 40 people are like, yeah, I can do that. We could use another one or two. Paul's going to bring that up. But, you know, just ways to be connected. And almost every small group we have, we didn't come up with, somebody else did, right? I mean, that people are hungry to find a way to connect. And not just us, right? But those people who are so lost. I know I've brought this up before, but after the insurrection, Luke Mogelson, who writes for the New Yorker, he had been embedded for 4 years with our soldiers in Afghanistan. I think he's embedded in Ukraine now. But between that, he was embedded with the far right. And so he was in the Capitol on January 6th, and he had his press pass hidden. And he wrote about it, a long story in the New Yorker about what he saw that day. Of course, there were some people who had come there loaded and armed and ready to go, and they had a plan. But what struck him was how lost people were. That they wandered around in the Capitol after they'd broken in on the Senate floor, on the House floor, and he said they just looked lost. People got their phone out. He heard one guy say, well, maybe I'll call my dad. Lost. Or I think of that Reed Berkowitz. He's that genius game designer. He does those like Dungeons and Dragons, alternative reality games, the kind of games that start behind a computer, but then they call you out to go out and look for clues and solve riddles. And at their best, it's about collaboration and cooperation. At its best, it's the kind of game that helps a young kid feel a little bit better about himself and think, well, maybe I'll even go to school tomorrow, that kind of a thing. And he talked about how sad he was when he realized that QAnon and Q, that it was the same kind of game, that it relied on the same kind of thing. But instead of bringing kids out to be to one another, it leaves people down this rabbit hole of hate and replacement theory and racism and all that. And the woman interviewing him said, is it possible to re-engineer a game, to come up with another game that takes those people out there who are lost with hate, and bring them back in? And he said, no, the answer is not another game. The answer is a community. The answer is a community of love and care. The answer is trying to hold these people close. Talk about power. Kat Morrissey, 72, was one of the women who was killed. She was a part of the We Are Women Warriors group in Buffalo. That was a group about empowerment. It was a group that worked with individuals and families that had been left behind. She was the person in their community who was always writing the letter to the editor. That's who she was. Just in the last year, letters about gentrification and civil rights and education, and just in the last few months, a letter about the need for gun control. There had been a shooting, and she had just written a letter about the need for gun control. She was like this fierce activist, this incredible woman. She was also all about beauty. She was so close to her brother and sister that they lived on the same street. And not just lived on the same street, she cared for her yard, and she planted flowers, and not just her yard, the whole street, right? She mowed the whole street, 72, she made the whole street, and she planted the flowers, and she planted the flowers in the meeting. And then it wasn't just enough for that. It was like out into the community, and she was planting murals, and she was doing all these remarkable things. And she loved kids, and her sister talked about how last year she bought a broccoli costume and put it on and went to the school to talk to kids about eating healthy. That's who she was. That's who she was. And one of the activists with her said, oh my goodness, we lost a voice yesterday. Oh my, we lost a voice. And another one said, yes, she's been martyred, and that will empower other people to stand up and be more righteous. Over and over and over, the families of those lost have looked at us and said, this was the most amazing person. This person was the most powerful person. This person was the most important person in my life. And then they've stopped and they've looked at us and they've said, what are you gonna do about it, right? Because Ruth Whitfield, after she talked about her mother who makes the best macaroni and cheese and took her camping and fishing, she said, how dare he take my mother and my best friend? This is wrong, and it needs to be fixed ASAP.
Yes.
That's what she said. Or like the young niece of Kat Massey, she wrote this beautiful, beautiful thing about what they teach their kids. And she said, I hope you people I hope whoever you are, I hope whatever you teach your kids, you teach your kids to love. Because that's not what my aunt represented. She represented love. She taught us to love everybody. I don't know what you teach your kids, but that's what we teach our kids. We're called as people to be open every single day to God's power and to give witness to it. And so my prayer and my pledge is that we might never lose that song that little Roberta sang. I want to dance with somebody. I want to feel the heat of somebody, right? I want to be loved by somebody. What else does anybody really want on this earth, right? Can we just find a little simple way for all of us to be just a tiny bit more in touch with our power, whatever that power is, so that it can show up in the world, so that we can do justice to these beautiful people who came, who lived, who gave the best. May we be worthy of their sacrifice. Amen. Amen.